Ceramic tile is great for floors. It's attractive, hard-wearing, easy to clean, and it comes in styles, colors, and patterns to match any decor. The quality of the finished floor depends on two things: careful planning and the quality of the surface beneath it. For best results, use backerboard to create a smooth, level surface. In this demonstration, we'll be installing backerboard and 16-inch by 16-inch field tiles in a kitchen.
Before installing the backerboard, check the subfloor to be sure it isn't warped, loose, or damaged. Pull out any loose nails and replace them with deck screws to eliminate squeaks.
Measure the space to determine how much backerboard is necessary. Multiply this number by 5% to allow for mistakes and unusable pieces.
Check the installation area so that it's free of dust, dirt, and debris. Use a vacuum to make sure everything is completely removed.
Lay out the pattern for the panels. Plan the layout so the backerboard will span and reinforce the joints in the subfloor. Also, plan on starting every other row with a half panel so the corners of adjacent panels don't line up. Snap chalk lines to show where each panel will go.
Before you mix up the first batch of mortar and start putting down the backerboard, decide where you'll lay the first panel. If it'll be a partial panel, cut it to size ahead of time.
To cut backerboard, measure and mark cutoff lines on both sides of the panel with a felt tip pen or carbide scoring tool.
Align a straight edge with a line on one side of the panel and pull the scoring tool along it several times. Make as many passes as you need to break through the mesh on the surface.
Place the straight edge on the other side of the panel and repeat the process. With the backerboard on a flat surface, press down one side of the cut line with your hand and knee. With the other hand, lift up just enough to snap the board along the scored edges. Some types of backerboard may leave a sharp edge along the cut line, so be careful when handling the cut board.
Mix your latex modified thin set mortar as instructed in the technique section of Tiling 123. Then, using a square notch trowel, apply mortar and comb it into straight vertical ridges as described in the technique section of Tiling 123.
Immediately put the first piece of backerboard in place. If you don't set the panel when the mortar is wet, gaps will form between the floor and panels, and the tiles will crack when you walk on the gaps.
Place spacers at the walls to leave a gap between the wall and the backerboard as recommended by the manufacturer. To set the panel in the mortar, walk on it gently.
Fasten the panel to the floor with 1 1/4 inch backerboard screws. Follow the manufacturer's instructions for proper spacing and placement. Drive the heads flush with the surface. Screws placed around the outside of the panel should be a 1/2 inch from the edge.
Apply mortar inside the layout lines for the second panel, the same way you did for the first panel. Set the panel in place and put spacers at the walls to leave the proper gap.
Using 16 penny nails as spacers, leave a 1/8 inch gap between the panels.
One at a time, lay the rest of the panels around the room. Continue to use spacers at the walls and leave 1/8 inch gaps between panels. Once all of the panels are in place, remove all the spacers.
Fill the spaces between the panels with mortar. Use a margin trowel to smooth it and form a 3 inch wide band centered on the joint.
Put fiberglass backerboard joint tape across all of the seams and firmly embed them into the mortar. Cover the seams with more mortar and smooth it with a trowel. Don't expose the tape, just feather the edges of the mortar. Once the mortar is dry, you're ready to start tiling. The first step is to lay out the floor. Proper pre-planning will help you avoid costly, time-consuming mistakes and a lot of frustration. Laying the plan out on graph paper will help you decide where to start and what the finished floor will look like. There are also software programs available that can help you design, plan, and estimate quantities. To begin the actual layout, start by finding the center of the room. Measure the longest wall, calculate its midpoint, and mark it. Do the same on the opposite wall and snap a chalk line between the two midpoints. Repeat the process for the other two walls.
The two guidelines you snapped, called layout lines, must be square to each other. If they're not, the tiles won't be centered and the room will look unbalanced. Here's how to measure for square.
Starting at the intersection of the lines, measure and mark one of the layout lines at 3 feet. Measure and mark the other layout line 4 feet from the intersection. If the two lines are square, the distance between the two marks you made will be exactly 5 feet. If it is, you're ready to go. If it's not, draw the diagonal line on the floor with a pencil for reference.
To fix the problem, move the end of either of the layout lines. Whichever line you choose, move the end closest to the pencil line you sketched on the floor. If the diagonal measured more than 5 feet, move the end of the line toward the 90-degree angle. If it measured less than 5 feet, move the line away from the 90-degree angle. Snap a new line.
To make the process of actually laying out the tiles in mortar easier, it helps to set them in sections or grids. To lay out the sections, make a jury stick. Lay out a section of tiles with spacers and place a piece of 1-inch stock along one edge. Mark the edges of the tiles on the stick. Set the stick along the wall and mark the floor at each mark on the stick. Repeat this for each wall.
If you're working in a smaller area, you can set out tiles to check your layout. On a large floor, snap chalk lines to create a layout grid. Then you're ready to set your tiles.
Without mortar, lay out a row of tiles along the chalk lines in both directions, starting at the center point and working out. Insert spacers between the tiles. Stop when the remaining space is less than a full tile. If the space between the last full tile and the wall is less than half a tile wide, move the layout line parallel to that wall until the tiles at both ends are equal width. Repeat the process for the tiles along the other layout line. Re-snap the lines and measure to be sure they're still square. Starting at the center of the room, use a trowel to spread and comb mortar up to the edge of one of your layout lines.
Put two tiles in place next to each other with a spacer in between and press them firmly into the mortar. If mortar squeezes up between the tiles, the bed is too thick and the ridges need to be shorter. Lift up one of the tiles and look at the bottom. The mortar should cover the entire surface. If you see parallel lines, the mortar is too dry. If the ridges of the mortar have left solid lines on the tile, the bed is too thin and you need to increase the height of the ridges. Place spacers beside the first tile and set the second tile in place, twisting it slightly.
After you've installed 3 or 4 tiles, place a 2x4 or beater block on top of them and tap lightly with a hammer or rubber mallet. This will level the tiles and embed them firmly in the mortar. Continue setting tiles in the same way until you reach the end of the layout section. Use a damp sponge to clean off any mortar that sticks to the top of the tiles. Don't let it dry. After you've finished the first section, work on a neighboring section in the same quadrant. Spread mortar on the grid and lay the tiles. Keep laying tiles in this pattern until you reach a point where the space between the tiles and the wall is less than a full tile width. To cut the tiles along the wall, place the tile you're going to cut directly on top of the last full tile near the wall. Place a second tile upright against the wall. And place a third tile against it and on top of the tile to be cut. Trace along the edge of the third tile to draw a line on the first tile. Cut the tile and it will fit perfectly into the space. It's a good idea to measure, cut, and install one tile at a time. Continue tiling until the floor is complete. Once all the tiles are in place, let the mortar dry completely. Each type of mortar has a different curing time. Follow the manufacturer's instructions.
Grouting is the next step in the tiling process. Grout fills the space between the tiles. Grouting is messy, so be sure to properly cover any areas that you don't want to get dirty. Before you start, remove any excess mortar with a razor blade or a putty knife. Using a margin trowel, mix the powdered grout with liquid and apply it as recommended in the techniques section. Skim the excess grout off with the edge of the float. To avoid digging into the joints, move the float diagonally across the tiles. The grout will set up in about 5 to 15 minutes and have a putty-like consistency. When a thumbnail pressed against it doesn't leave an impression, the grout is hard enough for the final cleanup.
With a damp sponge, wipe the tiles diagonally to clean them. Rinse the sponge frequently in clean water. Remove any remaining haze as instructed in the technique section. Cure the grout as instructed in the technique section of tiling 1, 2, 3, and let it set thoroughly before applying sealer. The curing process is very important. Do not disturb it. Once the grout has cured, apply sealer with a sponge. Sealing tile grout gives it a greater water and mildew resistance and helps keep it from getting dirty. Make sure to wipe off any excess within 10 minutes. Don't let it dry on the tile. And if you're using an unglazed tile, seal it as well.